In March 2018, a routine environmental assessment document appeared in the Federal Register. It was dense bureaucratic prose, the kind that typically draws no public attention. But buried in Appendix C was something extraordinary, a reference to Operating Location 37, accompanied by geographic coordinates that placed it in the remote deserts of western Utah. For the first time in official documentation, the government had acknowledged a facility that for 70 years had existed only in whispered rumors and redacted reports. The coordinates pointed to a square of restricted airspace larger than Rhode Island, a place where the desert itself had been weaponized, where scientists had learned to manufacture death on an industrial scale, and where the very air had become a classified secret. This documentary is the story of that designation. To understand it, we must first define our terms with absolute precision. When we say Area 37, we mean the Dugway Proving Ground Chemical Test Complex, Operating Location 37, inside the Utah Test and Training Range. We distinguish it clearly from the Michael Army Airfield, the nearby Granite Peak facility, and the separate biohazard research stations. This distinction is essential, providing the framework for our narrative and establishing a clear boundary between documented fact and the enduring speculation that grew in the shadows of its perimeter fence. But before the designation, before the rumors, before the quarantine protocols and the hazmat teams, there was only emptiness. A basin of salt and sagebrush chosen for its isolation and its expendability. To understand how this forgotten valley became one of America's most controversial secret installations, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the United States was losing a war it had barely begun to fight. Back to 1942, every nightmare begins with a place. Before it was forbidden, this place was a fact. The Great Salt Lake Desert of western Utah is a landscape of geological extremity. Its heart is a vast playa of white alkali, a remnant of ancient Lake Bonneville that stretches to the horizon in every direction like a blank page. This is the Dugway Valley. For thousands of years it served no purpose. It was too dry for agriculture, too remote for settlement, too barren even for cattle grazing. The land's only distinction was its emptiness, an emptiness so complete that early Mormon settlers saw it and turned back. Its first brush with the modern world came not as a choice, but as a desperate necessity. By 1942, the United States had been at war for less than a year, and it was already losing. Not in ships or soldiers, but in chemistry. Intelligence reports from the European and Pacific theaters painted a terrifying picture. German forces had stockpiled thousands of tons of nerve agents, compounds so toxic that a single drop on the skin could cause death within minutes. The Japanese military had already deployed chemical weapons in China with devastating effectiveness. America's own chemical arsenal was primitive by comparison. And worse, the military had no scientific understanding of how to defend against this new class of weapon. The challenge was unprecedented. Chemical and biological weapons could not be tested at existing facilities. The risk of accidental contamination, of a single breach turning a populated area into a death zone, was absolute. What the War Department needed was a location so remote that even a catastrophic failure would harm no one. A place where the wind patterns were predictable, where the land was federally owned, and where the very isolation would serve as the primary containment system. They needed a void, and in the Dugway Valley they found the perfect one. The selection process was clinical. Army surveyors mapped the prevailing winds, studied the topography, and calculated exclusion zones. The Dugway Valley offered decisive advantages. It was encircled by mountain ranges that created a natural bowl, limiting the spread of airborne contaminants. It was already federal land, administered by the Bureau of Land Management, meaning acquisition would be swift. And critically, it was over 60 miles from the nearest town, a buffer zone that would allow for testing at scales that would be unthinkable anywhere else. The decision was made with wartime speed. The void had been given its terrible purpose. Construction began in the winter of 1942 under the administrative designation of the Dugway Proving Ground. Within months, a skeletal military installation rose from the desert floor. The first structures were rudimentary, laboratories built of cinder block and steel, observation bunkers half buried in the alkaline soil, and rows of temporary barracks for the scientists and soldiers who would operate in this hostile environment. A small airfield was graded into the hardpan to allow for the transport of materials too dangerous to move by rail. The work was performed with a secrecy that bordered on paranoia. Workers were told only what they needed to know, and the official explanation for the facility was deliberately vague. Testing of defensive smoke and incendiary devices. The truth was far darker. By the summer of 1943, Dugway had become the primary research, testing, and production site for America's chemical and biological weapons program. The facility's mission was threefold: to develop offensive chemical agents that could match or surpass German nerve gases, to test defensive equipment and protocols that could protect American soldiers from chemical attack, and to study the atmospheric dispersal patterns of airborne toxins under real-world field conditions. This third mission would prove to be the most consequential. To test how chemical weapons would behave in combat, the military needed to release them. And at Dugway, for the first time, they had the space to do exactly that. The scale of the testing was staggering. German village structures, perfect replicas down to the furniture and wallpaper, were constructed in the desert and subjected to firebombing tests to determine the most effective incendiary compounds. Live animals, thousands of them, were exposed to mustard gas, phosgene, and experimental nerve agents to establish lethal dose rates. Aerosol clouds of biological agents were dispersed across miles of open desert, while technicians in protective suits measured the drift and decay rates. From its very first days of operation, Dugway was a factory of controlled apocalypse, a place where the machinery of mass death was refined with scientific precision. And from those first days, the culture of absolute secrecy that would define it for the next 8 decades was forged. The weapons developed at Dugway during World War II were never used in combat. Germany, despite its vast stockpiles, never deployed its nerve agents, perhaps deterred by the certainty of retaliation. Japan's chemical program was halted by its surrender. But the existence of these weapons and the knowledge of how to create them could not be uninvented. When the war ended, Dugway's mission did not. Instead, it evolved into something more insidious, more permanent. It became the United States' primary laboratory for a new kind of warfare. One fought not with bullets, but with invisible, odorless killers that could end a life before the victim even knew they had been attacked. The Cold War transformed Dugway from a wartime emergency measure into a permanent fixture of American defense strategy. The facility expanded dramatically. New laboratories were constructed with advanced ventilation systems and airlocks designed to contain the deadliest pathogens known to science. A dedicated biological testing grid, miles long, was established in the most remote section of the range. This grid, internally designated as the Baker Test Site, but later known by the bureaucratic label Operating Location 37, became the heart of the facility's most sensitive work. It was here, in a landscape where nothing grew and nothing lived, that scientists released clouds of anthrax, U fever, tularemia, and dozens of other biological agents, measuring how far they traveled, how long they remained viable, and how effectively they could theoretically kill. To the handful of researchers who worked at Operating Location 37, the mission was framed as defensive. The official rationale, repeated in classified briefings and internal memos, was that understanding how biological weapons dispersed in the environment was essential to developing detection systems and medical countermeasures. To protect American soldiers and civilians, the argument went, one must first understand the threat in its most precise scientific detail. But the line between defensive research and offensive capability has always been perilously thin. The same knowledge that allows you to detect a biological attack also allows you to optimize one. And Dugway's research did both. The testing protocols were designed with extraordinary care to prevent accidental release beyond the controlled test grids. Every open-air trial was preceded by days of meteorological analysis. Tests were conducted only when wind conditions would carry the agent across the uninhabited sections of the range, away from the base itself and far from any civilian population. Monitoring stations equipped with biological detection arrays were positioned downwind to track the dispersal plume in real time. Animals placed in cages at measured intervals served as sentinels, their exposure providing hard data on lethality and infection rates. It was a system built on layers of redundancy, engineered to make a catastrophic accident statistically impossible. But statistics are not certainties. The Dugway sheep incident of March 1968 shattered the illusion of perfect control. On the morning of March 13th, ranchers in Skull Valley, a sparsely populated area approximately 30 miles from the Dugway boundary, discovered over 6,000 sheep dead in their pastures. The animals had died suddenly, exhibiting symptoms of severe neurological distress, frothing at the mouth, convulsions, and respiratory collapse. The die-off was unprecedented and terrifying. Local health officials immediately suspected chemical contamination, and their suspicions pointed in one direction, the secret base to the east. The military's initial response was immediate and absolute denial. Official statements claimed that no testing had occurred on the day in question and that Dugway's safety protocols made such an incident impossible. But journalists and independent investigators quickly established that on March 13th, an aircraft had indeed conducted a test flight over operating location 37, dispersing a nerve agent over the test grid. The substance was VX, one of the most lethal chemical weapons ever created, a compound so toxic that less than 10 milligrams absorbed through the skin is fatal to an adult human. The official explanation eventually shifted. The military acknowledged the test, but insisted that the release had occurred entirely within the authorized test area and that the sheep deaths were coincidental, likely caused by contaminated feed or natural disease. That explanation satisfied no one. Environmental testing of the dead sheep revealed traces of an organophosphate compound consistent with VX exposure. Meteorological reconstructions showed that on the day of the test, unexpected high-altitude wind shear had carried the aerosol plume far beyond the predicted dispersal zone, directly over Skull Valley. The evidence was damning, but it would take years of legal battles and a congressional investigation before the military, in a carefully worded settlement, quietly compensated the ranchers while still refusing to explicitly admit fault. The Skull Valley incident became a landmark moment, the first publicly acknowledged failure of a system that had been sold to the American people as infallible. The incident's consequences extended far beyond the dead sheep. It triggered a national reckoning with the entire concept of open-air biological and chemical testing. Public outrage forced the Nixon administration to confront a program that had operated in secrecy for decades. In 1969, President Nixon unilaterally renounced the offensive use of biological weapons and ordered the destruction of America's biological weapons stockpile. Chemical weapons testing continued, but under dramatically tightened restrictions. For Dugway, the Skull Valley incident marked a turning point. The work did not stop, but it retreated further into the shadows. And operating location 37, the site at the center of the controversy, became more secretive, more isolated, and more controversial than ever before. Secrecy, when maintained for decades, does not create ignorance. It creates speculation. The Skull Valley incident had pulled back the curtain just far enough for the public to glimpse the nature of the work at Dugway, and what they saw terrified them. a military facility conducting open-air tests with nerve agents and biological weapons, operating in near-total secrecy, with safety protocols that had catastrophically failed. The official admission, grudging and incomplete, only deepened the mistrust. If the government had lied about this, what else were they concealing? Into this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, a new narrative began to emerge, one that would transform operating Location 37 from a chemical test site into something far more sinister. In the public imagination, the first whispers began in the late 1970s among anti-nuclear and environmental activist groups. Monitoring military activities in the American West, researchers sifting through declassified documents under the newly passed Freedom of Information Act discovered references to programs with ominous names: Project Shad, Project 112, Charm, and dozens of others. These were large-scale tests in which military personnel, often without their knowledge or informed consent, had been exposed to chemical and biological agents to study the effects. The tests had taken place at Dugway and at sea aboard Navy vessels. The documents were heavily redacted, but what remained was damning enough. Soldiers used as test subjects releases of live pathogens over populated areas. Experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. As more documents emerged through the 1980s and 1990s, investigative journalists and researchers began to construct a more complete picture. They discovered that Dugway had not only tested known agents like anthrax and VX, but had also served as a development site for entirely new classes of biological weapons, genetically modified organisms designed to be more lethal, more resistant to treatment, and more effective at evading detection. The research had been justified under the umbrella of defensive preparedness, but the line separating defense from offense had been so thoroughly blurred as to be meaningless. The revelations were shocking, but they were also incomplete. Large sections of Dugway's operational history remained classified, hidden behind walls of national security exemptions that no FOIA request could penetrate. This is where documented history ended and mythology began. The information vacuum created by decades of classification became a breeding ground for darker theories. If the government had hidden these programs, activists and conspiracy researchers argued, what else were they hiding? The speculation centered on operating Location 37, the most remote and restricted section of Dugway, the place where even base personnel without the highest clearances were forbidden to enter. Reports began to circulate of strange lights seen in the night sky above the restricted zone, silent aircraft that moved in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics, and unmarked trucks entering and leaving the facility under heavy guard, their cargo unknown. By the early 2000s, the mythology had crystallized into several distinct narratives. The first and most persistent was that operating Location 37 was not merely a test site for chemical weapons, but a storage facility for the most dangerous substances on Earth: weaponized smallpox, genetically engineered superpathogens, and experimental compounds that had no antidote and no name. Proponents of this theory pointed to the facility's extreme isolation, its multi-layered security, and the fact that even after Nixon's 1969 order, certain categories of biological research had continued under the classification of defensive. The second narrative, more fringe but equally persistent, claimed that the facility was involved in reverse engineering foreign bioweapons, particularly those developed by the Soviet Union's infamous biopreparat program, and that live samples of the world's deadliest agents were being stored in underground bunkers beneath the Utah desert. The most extreme version of the mythology emerged in the post-9/11 era, fueled by the anthrax letter attacks of 2001, when it was revealed that the strain of anthrax used in those attacks matched a variety developed at U.S. military laboratories. And when the FBI's investigation pointed to a researcher at Fort Detrick who had connections to Dugway, the conspiracy theories reached a fever pitch. Online forums and alternative media outlets claimed that the anthrax attacks had been a false flag operation, that the pathogen had come from Dugway's secret stockpiles, and that Operating Location 37 was the site of ongoing illegal bioweapons production in direct violation of international treaties. These claims were never substantiated, but they didn't need to be. The government's own documented history of secret testing and its continued refusal to fully declassify Dugway's records provided just enough factual foundation to make the theories seem plausible. The mythology surrounding Operating Location 37 is pervasive and resilient, but resilience is not the same as truth. To separate verifiable fact from compelling fiction, we must examine the claims systematically, applying the same standard of evidence we would demand in any serious investigation. This requires us to ask 3 questions for each major claim. What can be independently verified? What is directly contradicted by available evidence? And what remains in the paradoxical space between confirmation and refutation, the realm of the genuinely unknown? Claim 1. Operating Location 37 is a storage site for illegal biological weapon stockpiles. The verifiable facts are these. The United States did maintain extensive biological weapons stockpiles until 1969, when President Nixon ordered their destruction. Dugway Proving Ground was one of the facilities involved in that destruction, and declassified records confirm that biological agents, including anthrax, Q fever, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis, were incinerated or chemically neutralized at the site between 1969 and 1973. Independent inspections conducted under the Biological Weapons Convention, which the U.S. ratified in 1975, have found no evidence of offensive biological weapons production or stockpiling at Dugway in the decades since. The story of Operating Location 37 is, at its core, a story about the weapons we created to protect ourselves, and the fear those weapons engendered in the very people they were meant to defend. It is a narrative that resists simple conclusions, because the facility itself has always existed in a space of moral and strategic ambiguity. The work performed there during World War II and the Cold War was born of genuine necessity, a response to existential threats from adversaries who possessed or were developing the same terrible capabilities. The scientists and soldiers who worked at Dugway were not cartoon villains. They were professionals operating under the belief that understanding these weapons was the only path to surviving them. But necessity does not erase consequence. The Skull Valley incident proved that even the most carefully controlled systems can fail, and when the system in question involves nerve agents and biological pathogens, failure is catastrophic. The secret human testing programs revealed through declassification showed that the pursuit of knowledge was sometimes allowed to override basic ethical boundaries, that soldiers and civilians were exposed to lethal agents without consent or adequate protection, all in the name of national defense. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented facts, admitted to by the very institutions that perpetrated them. And they form the factual foundation upon which the larger mythology was built. The mythology itself, the claims of super pathogens and false flag attacks and illegal weapons stockpiles, is harder to dismiss than it should be, precisely because the documented truth is already so disturbing. When a government admits to decades of secret chemical testing, to exposing its own soldiers to anthrax and VX, to maintaining stockpiles of the world's deadliest substances in underground bunkers, the leap to believing in even darker secrets becomes psychologically effortless. The conspiracy theories are not irrational responses to fiction. They are extreme extrapolations of confirmed reality, and yet extrapolation is not evidence. The examination of specific claims reveals a consistent pattern. The most sensational allegations are not supported by verifiable facts. Operating Location 37 is not a storage site for alien pathogens. It was not the source of the anthrax attacks. The lights seen in the sky above Dugway are almost certainly test aircraft from the adjacent Michael Army airfield or high-altitude research platforms, not evidence of otherworldly contamination protocols. The mythology, for all its emotional resonance and narrative coherence, remains mythology. The 2018 environmental document that first publicly acknowledged operating Location 37 by designation was not a dramatic revelation. It was an administrative necessity, a requirement for environmental impact review of planned construction at the site. But its publication marked a subtle shift in the government's approach to Dugway. By naming the facility in an official document, the Pentagon was implicitly acknowledging that the old strategy of absolute denial was no longer tenable in an age of satellite imagery, FOIA requests, and persistent investigative journalism. The base exists. Its work is real. And some measure of transparency, however limited, is now unavoidable. But transparency has its limits. The specifics of what is stored in the underground chambers at operating Location 37, the precise nature of the genetic research being conducted there, and the full scope of the facility's pathogen library remain classified and will likely remain so for decades to come. This ongoing secrecy ensures that the mythology will endure, that new generations of researchers and conspiracy theorists will continue to probe the gaps in the official narrative, searching for the hidden truth they believe must exist in those redacted paragraphs and exempted documents. In the end, we are left with a duality. Operating Location 37 is both a real place performing real defensive research under legitimate national security priorities, and it is a symbol, a dark mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties about the weapons we have created and the institutions we have empowered to wield them. It is a site where the boundary between protection and threat, between defense and aggression, has always been uncomfortably thin. The question is not whether the work at Dugway is necessary. In a world where chemical and biological weapons exist and continue to proliferate, some version of that work almost certainly is. The question is whether we can ever truly trust that the immense power concentrated in that remote Utah valley, the power to unleash invisible death on an unimaginable scale, will be used only to protect and never to harm. The desert keeps its secrets, but the desert does not judge. That responsibility falls to us, and the story of operating Location 37, with all its documented horrors and speculative terrors, is a reminder that the most dangerous weapons are not the ones our enemies possess. They are the ones we build ourselves, the ones we justify in the name of security, and the ones we hide behind walls of classification, hoping that secrecy will somehow contain the consequences of what we have made. The map now has a name, but the truth behind that name remains, as it has always been, a carefully guarded and deeply troubling unknown. However, the paradox lies in the nature of dual-use research. Dugway's current mission, as described in unclassified Pentagon budget documents, includes testing of biological detection systems and development of medical countermeasures against biological threats. This work, by necessity, requires the facility to possess live samples of the pathogens it is defending against. The distinction between a defensive research sample and an offensive weapons stockpile is largely a question of quantity and intent, both of which are classified. The facility undoubtedly possesses anthrax, plague, and other pathogens. Whether those quantities constitute a stockpile or a research collection is a semantic argument that cannot be resolved without access to classified inventories. Claim 2. Genetically modified superpathogens are being developed at the facility. This claim exists in a more complex evidentiary space. Advances in genetic engineering have made it theoretically possible to enhance the lethality, environmental stability, or antibiotic resistance of biological agents. Declassified portions of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, documents confirm that the U.S. military has funded research into genetic modification of bacteria and viruses, justified as necessary to understand potential threats from adversary nations. Some of this research has occurred at Dugway. In 2001, it was revealed that scientists at the facility had successfully reconstructed a genetically modified form of anthrax that was resistant to the standard vaccine, a project that sparked international controversy and accusations that the U.S. was violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the Biological Weapons Convention. The contradiction comes from the stated purpose versus the potential application. The official rationale for this research is to develop next-generation vaccines and treatments to stay ahead of potential bioterrorist threats. Critics argue that the same research provides a blueprint for creating the very weapons it claims to defend against, and that the secrecy surrounding the work makes independent verification of its defensive nature impossible. The truth likely lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. The research is genuine. The defensive justification is partially sincere, but the knowledge generated is inherently dual use and could be weaponized. The evidence supports the existence of controversial genetic research, but not the existence of deployable superweapons. Claim 3. The facility was the source of the 2001 anthrax letter attacks. This is the most serious allegation and the one most thoroughly investigated. The FBI's Amerithrax investigation, which lasted nearly a decade, concluded that the anthrax used in the attacks was the Ames strain and that it originated from U.S. military biodefense laboratories. The primary suspect, Bruce Ivins, was a researcher at Fort Detrick who died by suicide before he could be charged. Ivins had professional connections to Dugway and had visited the facility, leading to speculation that he had obtained or cultivated the anthrax there. The evidence, however, points elsewhere. Genetic analysis of the attack anthrax showed it was most closely related to a sample maintained at Fort Detrick, not Dugway. Investigative records indicate that Ivins had access to the necessary equipment and materials at his own laboratory. While Dugway does maintain anthrax samples and has the capability to produce anthrax in quantity, the FBI found no evidence that the attack material was produced there. The conspiracy theory conflates capability with culpability. Dugway could have been the source, but the available evidence indicates it was not. This examination reveals a pattern. Many of the claims about Operating Location 37 are built on a foundation of real, documented activities. The facility does possess deadly pathogens, does conduct genetic research, and did have connections to the anthrax investigation. But the leap from these facts to the conclusion of ongoing illegal weapons programs requires evidence that has not been produced. The mythology is powerful not because it is entirely false, but because it is built on a scaffold of partial truths, each one distorted just enough to support a more sinister narrative. While the myths surrounding Operating Location 37 have calcified into a permanent fixture of conspiracy culture, the facility itself has continued to evolve, adapting to new threats and new missions that bear little resemblance to the Cold War chemical testing that first gave it notoriety. The Dugway Proving Ground of 2024 is a sprawling complex of over 800,000 acres, making it larger than the state of Rhode Island. It is home to approximately 2,800 military and civilian personnel, and its annual budget exceeds $300 million. But the work it performs, while still classified in its specifics, has shifted in focus from offensive weapons development to something the Department of Defense now frames as existential defense preparation, the modern mission of operating. Location 37 and the broader Dugway complex centers on three primary areas. The first is testing of chemical and biological detection systems. As sensor technology has advanced, the military has sought to develop portable, rapid response systems that can identify the presence of airborne pathogens or chemical agents in minutes rather than hours. These systems are tested at Dugway by releasing controlled quantities of live agents or chemical simulants across the test grids and measuring the sensor's accuracy, sensitivity, and false alarm rates. This work is considered essential to protecting military forces deployed in regions where the threat of chemical or biological attack remains real. The second mission area is the evaluation of personal protective equipment. Every gas mask, hazmat suit, and collective protection system used by the U.S. military is tested at Dugway under conditions that replicate the worst-case scenarios: extreme heat, prolonged exposure, high-concentration agent clouds. The testing is brutal and exacting because the cost of equipment failure in a real-world contamination event is measured in lives. Mannequins equipped with internal sensors are placed in exposure chambers and subjected to lethal doses of nerve agents and biological aerosols, while researchers measure how quickly the agents penetrate protective barriers. It is grim work, but it is also undeniably defensive in nature. The third and most controversial area is what the Pentagon euphemistically calls threat characterization. This involves obtaining samples of foreign chemical and biological weapons or their precursors, analyzing their composition, and developing countermeasures. In practice, this means that Dugway maintains a library of the world's most dangerous substances: Russian Novichok nerve agents, Syrian sarin variants, North Korean VX formulations, and biological agents from decommissioned Soviet bioweapons programs. The justification is straightforward. You cannot defend against a weapon you do not understand. The criticism is equally straightforward. Possessing and studying these agents is functionally indistinguishable from possessing the capability to produce them, and the secrecy surrounding the work makes international verification nearly impossible. This is the modern paradox of Dugway. The facility's current work is almost certainly more focused on defense than offense, driven by genuine concerns about bioterrorism and the proliferation of chemical weapons to non-state actors. But the infrastructure, expertise, and stockpiles required for defensive research are the same ones required for offensive weapons production. The facility exists in a permanent state of dual-use ambiguity, and as long as significant portions of its work remain classified, that ambiguity will continue to fuel speculation and mistrust. The physical security of the facility reflects this reality. The perimeter of the Dugway restricted area is marked not by fences, but by an exclusion zone enforced by remote surveillance, aerial patrols, and a legal framework that makes unauthorized entry a federal felony. Warning signs posted at intervals along dirt roads state plainly, restricted area, use of deadly force authorized. Unlike Area 51, which has become a tourist attraction and the subject of ironic internet memes, Dugway has remained genuinely off-limits and genuinely feared. There are no gift shops selling Operating Location 37 t-shirts, no crowds of UFO watchers gathering at the fence line. The base's isolation is geographic, legal, and psychological. It's a place the public has been conditioned to avoid, not out of curiosity satisfied, but out of a primal understanding that what happens there is best left unknown.